This week, we are shifting from mainstream criminology to critical criminology. Most of the theories that we have discussed have fallen under the category of mainstream criminology. This week, we start our discussion of critical criminology with labeling theory. So, critical criminology takes the conflict model approach to understanding criminality and criticizes mainstream criminology for its consensus model approach. So, if you recall, probably from like the first week of the semester, we discussed a difference between the consensus model and the conflict model. Under the consensus model, everyone in society agrees that an act should be considered a crime. There is the assumption that society is a stable entity in which laws are created for the general good of the people. Now, the conflict model assumes that the ruling class makes the laws and that the laws are a means of control of the lower classes. Therefore, the laws represent the interests of specific groups. Particularly, it keeps those who are in power powerful and those who are powerless at a disadvantage. So, critical criminology takes that consensus model approach and argues that the laws are not created to benefit all the people. The laws have not been created through a consensus of the people. Rather, the laws are created to benefit the few over the majority. And so critical criminology criticizes the role of the state, meaning the role of the government, and the role of the state's policies in creating crime. There are four main theories that fall within critical criminology: labeling theory, crime and market societies, peacemaking criminology, and conflict criminology. Under conflict criminology, we have two other paradigms: Marxist criminology and gender theories. Most of the critical criminology theories emerged in the 1960s and the 1970s, mainly because of the political context and overall societal climate of that period. Now, I know probably none of you were born in the 60s or 70s, but I'm sure you are aware of the political climate during the 60s and 70s. So the 1960s is when we have the growth of the civil rights movement. Vietnam War was also played a significant role as the people began to question the role of the state. You have the Watergate scandal, and we have the Kent State University protests, in which the students were protesting against the Vietnam War, and the National Guard was called in, and students were gunned down, chased, and beaten. We also had the Attica riots during this time, in which 32 inmates and 10 guards were fatally wounded. And so these particular events were evidence that the state was in a legitimacy crisis. And the people believed that the government was abusing its powers. The 1970s, we also saw other civil rights movements. We saw the LGBT movement emerge in the 1970s, and the feminist movement emerged during this time. All three of these movements, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the LGBT movements, these movements demonstrated a lot of the flaws within the state. And so that leads to labeling theory. So labeling theorists argue that behaviors are not inherently criminal or deviant. Rather, the state defines those behaviors that are criminal and those behaviors that are legal and acceptable. And labeling theorists identify a variety of examples to demonstrate how the state plays a role in actually creating criminality. What is a crime varies by time, varies by place, varies by who is engaging in the behavior, and varies by consequences. So, a variation on time, for example, is the prohibition of alcohol. Obviously, it was illegal before, and it is not illegal now. Variation place, you can look at prostitution laws and marijuana laws in the United States. Prostitution laws in the state of Nevada, prostitution is legal, although it's not legal in the county of Las Vegas. Marijuana for recreational use is legal in 4 states: Oregon, Alaska, Colorado, and Washington. And I'm sure that that will grow. Who engages in the behavior? We have particular laws that are written for those who are under 18. We have particular laws that are written for those between 18 and 21. And then the consequences of behavior. So, for example, drinking and driving is acceptable as long as you're not over a certain limit. And that's often not even the case, right? The majority of people who drink and drive get home without getting into any car accidents at all. So here on this slide, I have a few examples of how new laws are created based on the actions of a few people. So marijuana was criminalized because Anslinger, who was a head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, advocated for the criminalization of marijuana since it was a substance primarily used among the Mexican migrants. Stephen Foll, with the use of radiology, was able to identify the abuse that children were experiencing that created child abuse laws. Kathleen Tierney, who was a powerful feminist, advocated for domestic violence laws, which were never on the books prior. So labeling theorists identify how the law is not fair, and rather, law enforcement is very selective. Law enforcement can decide at any point in time on whom to charge what crimes. Law enforcement is very selective in deciding when to arrest and for what to arrest. So labeling theorists explain then that criminal behavior is actually a process. And it's a process in which some behaviors are labeled as crimes and some people are labeled as criminals. But not all people who engage in the same act are considered criminals. And this is particularly the case when the label is imposed by the state versus your parent or your teacher. So social behavior then is dynamic. It consists of actions and reactions. It is constantly changing. How we perceive ourselves, it is constantly changing. Those reactions affect how we see ourselves. Labeling theorists borrow from symbolic interactionism. They describe how our identities are based off of the messages that other people have for us. So how other people define who we are affects how we define ourselves. And so how we act then depends on the meanings that we have on ourselves. So just to kind of recap here, labeling theorists describe that our behavior, whether it's criminal or not criminal, is determined by a process of labeling. The state defines behaviors as criminal or not. The state imposes that label on you, and then you begin to see yourself as that criminal. So labeling theory then shifts the focus from the offender to the behavior of the labeler, the reactor, and the controller. So we are no longer focusing on offender behavior. We are focusing on the process in which the offender is labeled. Labeling has some significant impacts on individuals. It leads others to make assumptions about offenders. Often, these assumptions are stereotypes. It affects how people react and interact with offenders. And here on this slide, I'm putting criminals in quotations because we know that if that individual behavior wasn't labeled a crime, these individuals would not be criminal. So if you are knowingly interacting with an offender, you're going to treat them differently than if you never knew that person was an offender. Once the offender is labeled as a criminal, that individual is cut from many of the pro-social bonds. And at this point, you should know that informal social control is the most effective method of controlling behavior. So when we cut individuals from their pro-social bonds, it actually traps them into a criminal career because they are cut off from those bonds or informal social controls that actually inhibit their behavior. So in the next lecture, I'm going to discuss one of the first labeling theories. If you have any question or if this was at all confusing, please shoot me an email and a question via Q&A.